Now, the original Suzuki Hayabusa was an absolute legend of motorcycling, and so naturally this latest incarnation makes plenty of references back to it. You can see it in the large dimensions, the rounded shape, that distinctive elongated headlight at the front there, and all the little graphics and logos dotted around the bike. Clearly, Suzuki are targeting a customer who remembers that original bike and wants to recapture some of that experience. But personally, I was too young at the time that that bike came out to be riding 200-mile-per-hour motorcycles, and so I don't have that reference point from which to review this bike. But for me, that made it all the more interesting. Without all that context and nostalgia and hype, is it still a good bike? Well, in this video, we'll go through all of the details and find out. But before we get started, a massive thanks to Speedo Angels for sponsoring this video. They make these dash protectors that could save you hundreds, if not thousands, if you scratch or damage your dash. Take the Busa for example, where it's 200 quid for a cover or 2 grand if you need the whole assembly. And yet a Speedo Angels dash protector costs just a few quid. Plus, they've got products for most new bikes from all the major manufacturers, so check out the link in the description for their full range, and you'll also find a 20% discount code down there specifically for my viewers. Now let's start with the engine, and I think it's fair to say that when this latest iteration was announced, it was a little bit of a disappointment for some people that it makes less peak power than the previous generation. That was always going to be a bit of a challenge from a marketing perspective, especially for a line of bikes that's so well known for top speed and massive amounts of power. But I think the reality when you actually ride it is that it's still blisteringly quick. Peak power comes in at just under 190 horses, but I think the key thing about it is that it's made at just under 10,000 RPM, so relatively low in the rev range when you set it against some of the more regular premium sports bikes on the market. Plus, it makes 150 Newton meters of peak torque at around 7,000 RPM, and so it really does have a massive amount of mid-range, and that means you've just got instant pull at any speed, right down from 0 up to the legal limit, and let's just say it goes well beyond. Thing is though, beyond all that speed and power, what makes it quite pleasant to ride is the sort of level of refinement. It's a really smooth engine, and there's a particular sweet spot just over 4,000 RPM where in 5th gear you're doing about 70 miles an hour, in 6th it's about 80, and it just gets ridiculously smooth there. So smooth that all you can feel through the pegs and bars is like the road surface beneath you, and it kind of feels a bit like riding an electric motorcycle. Plus, you've got a really nice gearbox, you've got a quick shifter that works very nicely both up and down the box, and then it's got that beefy sound that you'd expect from an inline 4 that's so large in capacity. Amplified ever so slightly, I'd say, by these official Akropovich accessory silencers. They don't make it massively loud, so if that's your sort of thing, you don't want it to be ear-bleedingly loud, but you just want a bit more bass and then something that looks quite nice, then these do the job pretty nicely. Now onto the handling, and I've got to say, on the one hand, I've been pleasantly surprised by this bike. Yes, the suspension does bias a little bit towards comfort and cushiness, but it's actually really quite composed, and you can push it a little bit harder than you might expect. Also, they've massively updated the braking since the previous gen, and so again, there's ample power there, despite the bike's considerable weight. But that's the thing, you can't really get around the fact that it weighs 264 kilograms curb, and that's just like 4 kilograms shy of something like a BMW GS Adventure. Plus, it's super long, obviously it's built for stability, and it's really quite wide, and so it does feel like a big, substantial motorcycle. And so if you're looking for that agile, sort of pin-sharp sports bike handling, obviously you're not going to get it here, but just as one part of what this bike does, it's still plenty of fun to ride it through corners. Now, where it's actually really impressed me is the comfort levels, and I think that's related to a lot of the things that we've already talked about. Firstly, the smoothness of the engine and the way that it just delivers that massive amount of grunt, but it barely feels like it's stressed at all. The weight of it as well, it just irons out the bumps in the road. And then the suspension, which, like I said, I think it's been set up to be a little on the soft side, but when you're cruising in a straight line on the motorway, you're definitely glad of it. The whole idea is to be fast in that sort of effortless way, and I don't don't think I've ever ridden anything like this that just feels like it wants to fly, and yet it really doesn't kick up any fuss at all. On top of that, for somebody of my height, around 5'9", there's plenty of space, and I really like the fact that it doesn't have that typical tiny tail section that you find on a lot of modern sports bikes. It's really pretty substantial. Even the passenger seat is nice and wide with a big grab rail, and this is quite padded as well, and so it feels almost like an adventure bike seat more than a sports bike, and so it's definitely super comfortable. It is still a sporty riding position. You know, you do have to reach down to the bars. You'll find yourself propping yourself up on the motorway a bit, and the screen's obviously not adventure bike tall, but it does mean that you can eat up miles on the motorway in pretty significant levels of comfort, and yet you can still peel off onto a more engaging road and have that more sporty riding experience. Now, as for tech, it is pretty well appointed. You've got those 6 riding modes, so A, B, and C, and then 3 user configurable. And within that, you've got 3 power modes to choose from, 10 stages of anti-wheelie and cornering traction control, 3 levels of engine braking, cornering ABS, link brakes, rear wheel lift control, cruise control, hill hold control, and then the quick shifter I mentioned. And so maybe the surprise is that you don't get a big TFT dash that you'd normally find on a bike nowadays to manage all those settings. Instead, you've got the big twin analog clocks and then a smaller TFT dash in the middle. And so despite having a fairly healthy list of tech, it actually feels quite simple and maybe a little bit old school when you're riding it. But I think that's because it's been built and designed to be evocative of the original Busa, and so the type of customer who's realistically going to buy this is probably going to appreciate those 2 big twin clocks, and they might also value features like great suspension and brakes over having radars either end or Bluetooth phone connectivity. Looks wise, they've definitely gone down that nostalgia route. You can see it in the shape of the bike. When you put them side by side, they're really distinctive and instantly recognizable versus anything else on the market. And so if you like the previous gen and you like the way it looks, you'll probably like how this looks. Also, I'd say it feels really nicely finished, perhaps a little bit above what I expected. And there are certain bits of hardware like the top yokes there and the mirrors that really feel quite high quality and like a decent amount of design effort has gone into them. As for whether it's my cup of tea though, styling wise, well, probably not, but I don't think it really matters, because for anyone who owned the original, this is almost certainly going to hit the spot. And look, recently we have had bikes like the Yamaha R7 or the Honda Hornet where the manufacturers tried to repurpose the name of the bike, but perhaps taken it in a little bit of a different direction. And I would say it hasn't gone down that well with the audience, but you can hardly accuse Suzuki of the same here. This thing is a dead ringer in almost every sense. Now onto the price, and it's pretty much 17 grand, which is a pretty substantial amount of money. And that price point definitely opens up a lot of alternatives that you could go for. But the thing is, it really does have a lot of charm. And after riding it for the past couple of weeks, I can sort of understand why people love the original so much. It's like I say, it's that completely effortless speed, and there's not really much else that I've ridden like it. So yes, those people who do remember the original, I think they'll probably be willing to pay for it because it's an emotional purchase. You're paying for that image and the way it makes you feel. But I think for anyone like me who's new to riding Hayabusas, you know, it really can still charm you, and it still offers plenty of objective strengths. It's very powerful, very torquey, very mid-rangey, super comfy for a sports bike, and it gets plenty of up-to-date tech even if it doesn't present them in a big TFT slab. Honestly, the only thing that I've ridden recently that sort of reminds me of it is the Ninja H2 SX. That's a big sports bike with lots and lots of power that feels like you could beast out miles on the motorway all day, but it takes a different angle. This looks back to the Busa. That's a very futuristic and modern design, and it embraces all the tech and features that you could ever want. The downside is the price point is significantly higher than this bike, but if you're interested in finding out more about it, you can see my 10 favorite features by clicking here right now.